Okay, so this week I would like to introduce to you uh, Dr. John Lennox, Lennox, uh, North Ireland born mathematician and apologist. And the book that I was focused on this week is called God's Undertaker. Not what I wanted to touch. Okay. Cover. I wonder if this will show. It's too bright. All right. You get an idea. Anyway. The subtitle is Has Science Buried God? And I will confess, this is also a slow read. I myself made it almost halfway through this week. But it's something that when you read, you need to consider slowly. And I appreciate the fact, and this is one of the things that recommended him to me for this study, that he does not write in a way that is difficult to understand. However, he does come out of academia, which means there is often a great deal to think about in a single sentence. So out of the chapters that I was able to finish, I just wanted to draw out a few things that might tempt you to investigate his writings yourselves. And I would recommend actually that if you do, that perhaps you decide to do it in a small group, like a book club, and just tackle a chapter a week and discuss it with other people, because like I said, there's a lot to think about in this. And one of the things that he talks about is this concept of the limitation of science. Now, his original specialty, as I said, was mathematics, but he also has degrees in the philosophy of science. And most people don't think about philosophy and science in the same breath, let alone in the same degree study. But he points out some very useful things. And one quote that I particularly like is, statements by scientists are not necessarily statements of science. And one thing you will find when people are reviewing or are interviewing scientists about popular works that they have written, everything they say tends to be taken as bearing the authority of science with the capital S. But what Lennox points out is that everyone who participates in scientific inquiry brings with him or her a philosophy, a worldview that impacts what they choose to study and often impacts how they interpret the results of their inquiry. And he says, there is a great deal of science that is not impacted by one's worldview. For instance, he says, when you are studying something at the microscopic level and you are describing its mechanisms, minimal impact by your worldview. Where this becomes a problem is in the asking of why. Why are things the way they are? And the bigger the questions, it seems like the more impact one's worldview has. And so in this particular book, he says that his discussion is not religion versus science, but really it's theism, which of course is the belief that there is a divine power, and particularly a divine power that is involved in the natural world to some extent, and people, right, don't agree on that either, versus naturalism, which says nature, the physical material world, is all there is. That it is a closed system with nothing outside it. And he goes to great extent in his efforts to prove that as a worldview, naturalism and its cousin materialism are self-defeating philosophies. Self-destructing is actually how he puts it, because there is one thing they don't tackle, and that is the brain that came up with the philosophy. Is it merely material, or is consciousness something that is not strictly material, that is in fact, in the technical term, supernatural, being above nature? And if, as the strict naturalists and materialists will say, the thought is just basically it's like a byproduct of natural processes, then everything they say is on a level of, at the risk of being crude, gas. That you cannot claim to say something is true without implying that you stand above what's looked at with the ability to examine it from, should we say, an elevation, from a position above what you're looking at and examining. He also goes into depth about these things that science really cannot explain. I was on YouTube looking up videos of lectures that he gives, and he has extensively lectured all over the place. So I actually do recommend, even if you do not decide to actually read the book, go online and look up some of his lectures. Because, for one thing, he is an engaging speaker. And for another thing, the stories he tells to illustrate his points really help you understand what he's saying better. He's talking about how he was at dinner one time with a man who sat down next to him and said, basically, I am a naturalist reductionist, so we have nothing to talk about. This is going to be a very boring meal. And he said, oh no, this is going to be a very interesting meal. And he said, all right, so you look at the menu. What do these letters spell out? The guy read off the word for him. And he says, how do you know? And he led him into talking about how consciousness, and particularly intellect, can't be either defined or adequately described by science. And yet they are necessary to the pursuit of scientific inquiry. And that's not something that people usually think about. That just being conscious at all, science can't explain that. The ability to use intellect, still more or less a scientific mystery. They can say what it does, and psychology, psychiatry, physiology, they can describe the process, but they can't say really where does it come from and why do we have it. But he also talks about this idea that the universe itself strongly implies the presence of what he calls an intelligent causation, meaning it was triggered by something that strangely resembles our intelligence. That there's a peculiar compatibility between the universe and human scientific inquiry. And if you think about that, right? I mentioned last week about how I really enjoy the story of the periodic table, right? I'm not a science person, but I love the stories behind things. And the fact that various elements were accurately predicted long before they were actually discovered, of course, suggests that there is such an order to the universe as to make accidental origin really, really unlikely. What I didn't know, because I find mathematics completely uninteresting, is that there have been many instances of pure mathematicians, as opposed to, of course, applied mathematicians, coming up with equations that, to their great surprise, adequately describe some physical phenomenon. And the fact that mathematics works has been commented upon, apparently, in scholarly circles as being one of the great mysteries of the world. The fact that something we invented can adequately describe things that we have not yet discovered. He uses the term rationally intelligible to describe the universe. And that strictly means that the universe can be figured out by human reason. And that leads to an interesting point too. People will often use faith and science as two opposing objects. But if people had not believed, right, without evidence as yet, that the world could be understood, science would not exist. That indeed, he spends a whole section talking about how there's a great deal of focus given to the ancient Greeks and the demythologizing of the universe that had to happen before science could take place. And how many people who don't want there to be a God and have admitted so publicly will take that and then say, all right, we need to demythologize it entirely. No gods, no God, nothing supernatural. But he points out that the ancient Hebrews were the first people whose worldview insisted that creation itself should not be mythologized. And I hadn't looked at it from that point of view before, but what exactly is the first commandment? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall have no other gods but me. And throughout Hebrew scripture, the repetition is, do not treat anything of the natural world as divine, because it isn't. And it was that point of view, the monotheistic, creation-based worldview, that gave rise to what we know in the Western world as science. And that isn't to say that the church as an institution, particularly as a political institution, has never gotten in the way of scientific inquiry. But he goes through very methodically and looks at how many of the great founding geniuses of science pursued scientific inquiry because they believed in God, that he had made, that his laws governed, and that they could be discovered by us. Particularly, one of the favorite stories that people like to recount to say that the church has always been against science, Galileo. However, Lennox points out that Galileo believed very firmly that God existed, that he had made all things, and that the only way to understand how he had made all things was to look at it directly. And that the first people to object to his empirical scientific theory was not actually the Roman Catholic Church. It was the academy of the day, the secular academy that was clinging to the science of Aristotle. There's a great deal that I really can't go into here. But the main thing that the early chapters of this book really lean on is that, and one of the quotes that he likes to use, C.S. Lewis, is men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. And of course, one of the scriptures that he uses to support this is in Romans chapter 1. You probably already know what I'm about to read to you. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. And it takes a great deal of intellectual dishonesty to insist that science proves that there is no God. First, because that's outside the realm of science. They do not have the instruments to test that theory. But also, it takes quite a lot of scientific dishonesty to claim that everything that is had to have come from random events. And this is where, go back to the limitations of science. Very important concept for us to remember. So there are a lot of people who have, shall we say, a minimal and very popular grasp of what science does, who will say, well, it's been proved, hasn't it? It's like, you have to understand what science can prove, what it can suggest based on the available evidence, and what it cannot touch. One of the things that it's like, science actually can't touch music. It can analyze a piece of music. It can analyze the paper that it's written on. It can analyze the sound waves. But it can't tell you if it's good or not. It can't look at a painting and say, this is a piece of art, or this is a piece of rubbish. It can tell you what the paint is made of. It can analyze the distribution of paint over the canvas. It can't tell you anything, though, about the quality of the painting. And one of the things he says also is the teaching of morality also basically exists outside of science. Science can tell you if you add strychnine to someone's drink, it will kill them. But science cannot tell you whether it is morally right or wrong to put strychnine into your grandmother's tea so that you can get your hands on her property. And he uses this one analogy, his Aunt Matilda's cake. And he said, well, let's suppose my Aunt Matilda has baked a beautiful cake. We take it along to be analyzed by a group of the world's top scientists. I, as master of ceremonies, ask them for an explanation of the cake, and they go to work. The nutrition scientists will tell us about the number of calories in the cake and its nutritional effect. The biochemists will inform us about the structure of the proteins and the fats, etc., in the cake. The chemists about the elements involved in their bonding. The physicists will be able to analyze the cake in terms of fundamental particles. The mathematicians will no doubt offer us a set of elegant equations to describe the behavior of those particles. And now that these experts, each in terms of his or her scientific discipline, have given us an exhaustive description of the cake, can we say that the cake is completely explained? We certainly have been given a description of how the cake was made and how its various constituent elements relate to each other. But suppose I now ask the assembled group of experts a final question. Why was the cake made? And of course, the conclusion he draws from this is that they will not be able to answer that unless they ask Aunt Matilda. Because there are certain things that science really can't analyze. For what event was this cake made? The secret lies in Aunt Matilda's mind, in her will. And he says, it's at that point that you either believe what she said about the cake or you disbelieve what she said about the cake. If she said, like he mentions, if she said that she made it for her nephew Jimmy's birthday, and you know for a fact she has no nephew Jimmy, then you will disbelieve her explanation. But if you, for example, are her nephew Jimmy, then your reaction will be quite different. There are a lot of things that science gives us. But the point is, there are certain things, certain very important things, that it cannot. when he talks about the concept of design. And one of the things I really do appreciate about what he writes is that his frequent drawing upon the writings of other people, both on the side of naturalism and on the side of theism. And one of his quotes that he uses, I believe, from Einstein himself, saying, "The most incomprehensible part about the universe is that it is comprehensible." It is a most unexpected thing when you approach the universe believing it to be random to find that it's orderly. But he also points out it is very difficult to shift a person's paradigm. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that concept, but the way that we expect the world to be, the way we firmly believe it to be, that's our paradigm. And throughout history, it has proven very difficult for any kind of evidence to shift people from their paradigm if it's firmly held. Harken again back to Galileo. The Aristotelian paradigm was so entrenched that it took generations before his discoveries became mainstream. For example, today, none of us believes that the Earth is the fixed center of the universe. Why don't we? The paradigm has shifted, but it took quite a while. And he mentions, and I honestly would like to look into this more, though I don't believe I would really understand most of it if I went to primary sources. But he talks about how certain discoveries in cosmology and astronomy are indicating a very definite beginning point and possible acceleration of the universe, which goes completely against, well, the view that was held up until probably the 20th century, was commonly held that the universe was actually eternal. But also that it isn't slowing down. And to be honest, I have yet to figure that part out. I'm like, what does this mean? How do you know this? But there are so many discoveries that strongly imply a beginning. That, of course, they had to come up with what they refer to as the Big Bang Theory. Long before it was a television sitcom, it was a scientific theory. And it shook people that there was some sort of what they call a singularity, a one-off event that kickstarted the universe. Of course, this is no shock to anyone who believes Scripture, that God spoke and things started. Now, Lennox has another book. It's called 7 Days That Divide the World, that I've It's been a while, but I have read that one. And he has a lot of interesting points to make about different ways to interpret the evidence surrounding the beginnings and ways to look closely and to really examine the text of Genesis in such a way that I'm not even sure how to put this. In such a way as to take seriously, if you will, the idea that, well, first off, the creation process actually happened, and that it is not irreconcilable from the scientific evidence that exists. But that's a different book. I recommend that one to you also. Or if you want to take a shortcut, go to YouTube and look up a lecture from a channel called Socrates in the City, where he basically lectures on that book. It's a good lecture. The introduction takes up like the first 15 minutes. I don't know if you've ever read anything by Eric Metaxas. He's done biographies on Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther, Mr. Wilberforce, who was instrumental in the abolition of slavery in the UK. But he is, man after my own heart, total smart aleck. And he likes to do very outrageous introductions of their guests, apparently. But I do recommend that video. If nothing else, it will give you a very good idea of the content of that fairly long and very well-written academic book. So, what do we take from this? Most of us are not scientists. Some of us have an interest in science, but probably haven't studied to the extent that we could give the kind of defense of Christianity that Dr. Lennox gives. But what do we take away from this? I would say probably the first thing that I take away from it is that science actually has as its foundation faith. And I'm not talking about religion, let alone specifically the Christian faith, but the faith that if you study physical phenomena, you will be able to understand it. The faith that there is sufficient order to what you are studying, there's sufficient intelligibility to it, that you'll be able to do something with it. And also, the fact that science has its limits. There have been claims made by this group referred to as the New Atheists that science can explain everything. Even if it hasn't done so yet, give it time, it will explain everything. Those kind of statements are statements of faith. They are not scientific deductions, if you will, conclusions based on study. Because however far scientific inquiry goes, it actually can't explain the very intellect that employs scientific inquiry, that propels it. It can't explain why. For that, you have to understand, or at least assume, that there is an intelligence behind the phenomena that can be asked why. And our faith, this is something that Dr. Lennox goes to great trouble to explain. Real faith is not what they refer to as blind faith, where in the absence of any evidence or understanding, we believe. No intelligent person actually holds a faith like that. Rather, based on what we see, based on our experience, we believe. So I'd like to actually leave you with a reminder of something that I am sure you already know. That faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen, and by it, people of old received their commendation. That by faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. No one saw the start of things except the one who was there, who started it himself. And it is our trust in him, based on our experiences with him and the experiences of others who went before us, that convince us that we can trust in him. And this is a great deal different from what is commonly assumed, that faith is only where there is no proof. He has proved himself again and again and again. The universe has proved itself to be sufficiently intelligible that it's only reasonable to presume some form of intelligence behind it. Because only intelligence can make intelligible things, just as only intelligence can search out and examine things that are intelligible. So I recommend to you the works and lectures of Dr. John Lennox. Next week, we will be shifting gears out of apologetics and into the preaching of the word. Because, right, we have devotionals that help strengthen us personally. We have apologetics that help us to guard our faith from opposition. And we also have what is possibly the most versatile and useful form of pointing toward the kingdom, preaching. And we will be looking at Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, a Welsh preacher. So we leave that till next week, though.